74-year-old Reddy died in the early hours of this morning after battling a long illness. Reddy was an anti-apartheid activist who was imprisoned and exiled in the 1970s and 80s. He held the position of head of radio at the SABC in the 1990s, and he also served on the boards of the National Lotteries Commission, the Centre for Indian Studies at Wits University, and the Institutional Forum at UNISA. Family friend and former colleague Amina Frense has described Reddy as a vibrant and passionate person, and she joins me now in studio to tell us a bit more. Amina, thank you for joining us under these circumstances. You knew Govan for many years, nearly 30 if I'm not mistaken. Just tell us about the man that he was, such an accomplished man.
Yes, well, condolences to the family and friends and wide associates here and all over the world. I got to know Govan Reddy by reputation, and then I met him in the flesh probably in the 1990s when he returned from exile. And I worked with him closely at the Institute for the Advancement of Journalism, where he was Deputy Executive Director. It was founded by Alistair Sparks in 1993. So that's where I worked closely with him. And then in later years, 1994 onwards, at the SABC. Where he was very deeply involved in the transformation of the airways, in the transformation of the media. He was for diversity in the media and democratic journalism, as we all know. And that is what he stood out for. He had a very distinguished career. He served on many bodies and so on. I had the pleasure of working closely with him, particularly at the SABC during the transformation years and in later years. He was Deputy Chief Executive at the time in 1997 at the SABC, but I think he was overlooked in terms of being appointed the CEO of the SABC, in my mind and the mind of many others. But I think that was then.
Yeah.
In later years, as recently as last year, in July last year, he, together with 6 other former South African Broadcasting Corporation executives, wrote a letter to President Zuma and the then Minister of Communication, expressing their grave concern at the way the SABC was going then.
Okay.
The grave concern was expressed about the deviation of what the SABC and a good public broadcaster stood for, and they mentioned the code of ethics and principles and practices are not being adhered to. So already then you could call them the SABC Executive 7 then in July last year.
Yeah. And I mean, he had the voice to be able to say that because he was an anti-apartheid activist. Tell us a bit about his time in exile.
I don't know terribly much of his time in exile personally, but I met him at the time that he was commuting between South Africa and Harare. I think he was at the time, he was editor-in-chief of a magazine called Africa South. But in those years, he was very active on other bodies as well. And in subsequent years, that was 1990, then he came back to South Africa. He was active in the Media Institute of Southern Africa, a regional advocacy media body. In fact, he was a founding member. He was there with the Windhoek Declaration as well. That was very, very progressive. The Windhoek Declaration subsequently has been adopted by the United Nations for 3rd of May, International Press Freedom Day. I think that is the official name. So he was very instrumental in that. He held other positions as well. He was president of the Commonwealth Broadcasters Association. He was with Inter Press Services. He was also for a while at the university. This is now subsequently after exile, coming back to South Africa and the democratic South Africa. He was also at the Solplaatje Institute in Grahamstown, for example, and was appointed, I think it is an appointment, Professor Extraordinaire at the University of Stellenbosch and the University of Pretoria as well. After he left the SABC, he was chief executive at the Mail and Guardian.
Okay.
And in later years, he was chairperson, I think, of the Lotteries Board. I think it was chairperson that he held. But he's seen as a media giant, as a media personality, as a media executive who really spoke up and stood out for democratic journalism and not happy with the way things were going post-1994.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because, as you said, he was sort of as you termed it, the Executive 7 already from last year. So what was his take on the political landscape currently?
That in particular is difficult to say precisely, but obviously concern at the way things are going. What people had given up their lives, sacrificed their lives, sacrificed the better part of their lives, those who survived, and those who had also given their lives, for democratic South Africa. There was concern about interference, there was concern about political interference, particularly in the media.
Yeah.
And of course, him together with a couple of others, they were not happy with it at all. But I think his legacy lives on.
Yeah.
I think through his works, through his writings, he already wrote in 1990 about the South African disinformation campaign. In 1992, 2 years before democracy, he was an advocate for the diversity of the media. And fortunately, we live in that era where we have media diversity. It has a lot of flaws at the moment. Things have gone, in another direction. But I think very involved, very passionate also about the real transformation, not only of the airwaves and media, but obviously our political landscape. So I would say concern and very concerned about, the latest developments right now where we find ourselves in.
So a very accomplished, very passionate person.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Amina, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Amina Frense with us speaking about Govan Reddy, who passed away this morning.